Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing really great, and make sure you go and get something fabulous to drink because we're on part 3 of our story tonight. So if you haven't heard part 1 and part 2, don't forget to click on the description. And don't forget to leave a comment because I do love hearing from you, and it really does help with the algorithms. And let's get started with part 3 of our story. I'm not sure why I woke up in the middle of the night, but I did. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. The time was 12:23. I was not sure why I'd woken up, but I felt as if something had prodded me wide awake, but nothing was there. I glanced around the bedroom and could make out the silhouette of the upholstered chairs next to a small open fireplace. I decided maybe I was a little chilly. Was that the reason I'd woken up? The temperatures can often dip in the mountains. I decided to put on a sweater, as I was a little chilly, and while I was awake, I'd answer a quick call of nature. I tiptoed to the ensuite bathroom and quickly emptied my bladder, returning to the bedroom and putting a sweater over my PJs. Now I felt a great deal better. I was a tad warmer. Surely I would get back to sleep very quickly. So I expected to return to bed without being awoken in the night once again by that cold air. That was when I noticed the curtain to the sliding doors in our bedroom was slightly ajar, and it niggled me. If I wanted to sleep in the next morning later than usual, to enjoy the benefits of our free day, it would be nice not to be awoken with the intrusive sunlight glaring through the room. So I hurriedly went over to the curtain, and something made me pull it back to take a look outside. At first all I could see was the dark sky, littered with a plethora of bright silvery stars that glittered in the firmament like diamonds. It was quite a light night. There was a full moon casting its prisms of pearly light over the landscape. But despite its subtle illumination, the trees in the background looked like dense, lofty silhouettes, from which all their distinguishing features had been eliminated. They were like vertical blobs on the landscape. I was staring out at the night for a minute longer, and then something distracted me. What the hell was that? I could see this tall, lofty, humanoid silhouette, built like a gargantuan giant. It was huge. I suddenly felt myself getting rather excited. My heart began fluttering in my chest, as if thousands of butterflies had taken up residence inside of me. No, it couldn't be. Surely not. There was no possible way. Things like this don't exist, do they? Not in our reality. I was reminded what Philip had said to me, to be careful that I did not doubt, as the universe might fight back and teach me a lesson. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared into the trees, and I was wondering if I'd seen a Bigfoot. But those things, no, they weren't real, were they? It couldn't be. There is no possible way. It couldn't have been a bear, though. This thing was way larger than a black bear and stood up on 2 feet, and it definitely wasn't a grizzly. What the hell had I seen? If I didn't find out what it was, I'd always be wondering and second-guessing myself, and that would bug the hell out of me. I just knew I couldn't return to sleep with this question hammering away at me in my mind like a woodpecker banging away at a trunk of a tree. I needed answers. I needed them now. And this could not wait. I didn't have the patience for all that. And what if I didn't see this thing again? Then I'd never know what it was that I'd actually seen. The moonlight had pronounced its dark silhouette so clearly, and it had looked exactly like I would expect a Bigfoot to look like. And if my eyes had not deceived me, then I needed to see this thing closer up. Over the years there had been cryptozoologists interviewed on various television channels, proclaiming that they believed that Bigfoot existed on our planet for thousands of years and had been hanging around here in North America, evading public scrutiny. For a long time people never believed pandas even existed, until it was then identified as a genuine species. What I had seen niggled me now far more than the open crack in the curtain that had triggered my irritation only moments before. But this strange, ambiguous, exciting sighting, however obscure and hazy, under the light of the moon, had been enough to stoke up the embers of my curiosity, and I would never ever forgive myself if I did not go after this thing. I could imagine years later saying to my grandchildren, "I think I saw a Bigfoot once." I could see their bright eyes widening as they asked me, "Well, Grandma, what did you do? Did you go after it? What did you see?" And the abject disappointment on their faces when I told them that I didn't. It would surely flatten me like an iron over a starched shirt. And I would feel as if I'd lacked the balls to chase after something that people have been questioning for years. I mean, if you see a flying saucer in your backyard emitting a green vaporous light, are you simply going to pull the curtains and return back to bed? I don't think so. You'd want to know what the hell was going on in your backyard. What on earth was that flying saucer doing there? It was no different to me. I couldn't do that to my future grandchildren. Deprive them of an idiosyncratic but fabulous story that they could share with their children's children over a crackling fire while roasting marshmallows. I had always been a seeker. I needed answers, and I was going to find them. I had seen something, and I simply had to satisfy my curiosity that was literally burning inside my chest. I mean, how many Bigfoot fans around the world would abandon anything and everything at the drop of a hat to see what I think I'd seen only moments before? Nancy was lying fast asleep in her bed, but I did not care. I wasn't going to spare her the courtesy of leaving her be. Not a chance. She needed to come with me on this nightly investigation. So I shook her vigorously, my impatience sparing her no mercy, nor any polite consideration. For my enthusiasm had shed such convivial niceties. Nancy groaned. "I'm trying to get to sleep." I didn't listen. "Nancy, wake up! You've got to wake up! Wake up now!" Nancy groaned. Slowly she lifted her flopping head from the pillow and sat up in bed, looking rather bemused. "What is it, Amelia? Is something wrong? You're not feeling sick, are you?" she asked, suddenly growing concerned, a furrow developing between her brown eyes. "You need to get a sweater on and a windbreaker and some walking boots right now," I told her. "We're going into the woods." Nancy was now looking at me as if I'd lost complete leave of my senses. "Why the hell would you want to do that, Amelia? Are you completely insane? It's cold out there and dark, and you want to go for a walk in the middle of the night in the wood grove? Do you have any idea the time of night it is now?" she said, glancing at the clock on her side table. "Nancy, I've seen something going into the woods. I think it might have been a Bigfoot. We need to go after it. I need to put my mind at rest and find out what this thing is. This thing that I just saw moments before. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I don't know, but I cannot spend the rest of my life wondering what I've just seen outside the window 2 minutes ago. Further down the field, close to the wood grove. You need to hurry up. We've got to go after this thing." Nancy pulled her face. "Let's get this right. You make fun of Philip talking about the Fae, and now you claim you've seen a Bigfoot. Is this the same person speaking?" "That's just it, Nancy. I need to see this, that this wasn't a trick of the light, that I'm not losing my mind, and my mind is not playing games with me." Nancy shook her head very vigorously. "You know, I really don't understand you, Amelia. You are such a cynic. Why do you want to go after this thing? You don't even know if what you saw was a Bigfoot." "Because, believe it or not, I don't like being a cynic. This thing, whatever it is, looked exactly like a Bigfoot, but it disappeared so quickly into the woods. But it had a humanoid shape. I just need to satisfy myself that I didn't see what I thought I saw." "You think we can just go into the woods and stumble across this thing you think you saw? It's probably long gone by now, and it probably wasn't even a Bigfoot. My guess is you saw a black bear, and bear encounters are not pleasant. We don't exactly have any bear spray with us at our disposal, do we? And if it was a Bigfoot, we don't know how dangerous those creatures might actually be. Either way, it's nonsensical to go chasing after this thing. Oh, get a grip, Nancy. You're so dramatic. Nothing is going to happen to us. We'll be very discreet." Nancy did not look very convinced, but she knew that I was not going to take no for an answer, and so reluctantly she rose out of her bed, and put on her sweater, her parka and her walking boots. "For the record, Amelia, just so that you know, I'm not remotely happy about this," she mumbled objectionably. "I don't honestly know why you always drag me to do these crazy things in the middle of the night. I don't know what you're thinking." "Oh, get a pair, won't you? Don't worry, I've got my torch with me. We'll see clearly enough." "Well, I've got my torch as well," she snapped. We were lucky that you could roll the sliding door open onto the private wooden deck, with steps that led to the ground below. The moment we opened the sliding door, the wind whipped against our faces, and the curtain in the bedroom billowed and ballooned. We steadily closed the sliding doors behind us, leaving it unlocked and slightly ajar, and we walked across the wooden deck. It creaked significantly, down to the steps onto the uneven, craggy ground that met our feet. We were greeted to a smoky, pewter-coloured sky that was illuminated by a very round, opulent-looking pearly moon that seemed to smile down on us. We could hear the trills of the crickets and frogs, and the dew of the grass brushed against our pyjama pants. I could see that Nancy was grimacing through pursed lips, looking as thin as licorice strings. I didn't care about her grumblings. She was muttering under her breath words like, "You're insane. This is madness. This is crazy. It's so dark. I can't believe you're making me do this, and you call yourself my friend. What if there's a predator in the woods?" I grabbed Nancy by the hand, pushing her ahead of me. "Stop dawdling, Nancy. Get moving," I said. Looking back, I was really rather brusque with her, and quite pushy, but I was itching to find out what I'd seen. And you know what an itch is like. You're never satisfied until you've given it a good old scratch. Lucky Nancy seemed to become rather quiet, very subdued. Either that or the sound of the rattling wind had graciously drowned out the noise of her mumblings. We ambled towards the grove of trees, where I'd seen the dark, shadowy silhouette moments before. I could see Nancy's eyes had suddenly grown wide with fear. She really was a scaredy cat, I thought to myself, rather smugly, as if in some way I was immune to fear. Yet I knew from bitter experience what fear really was like. But I failed to feel any sympathy for my friend, but secretly resented her for being so cantankerous. But in truth, I don't think many friends would have been willing to tag down a mountain trail in the woodgrove in the pursuit of a tall, ambiguous, shadowy being. So far as friends go, I was not actually giving Nancy any credit for at least agreeing to come with me, despite her vacillating hesitancy. She told me I never gave her a choice in the matter. Later she would say to me, "You were so pushy, Amelia, so demanding. It wasn't because I was being a loyal friend to you, but you looked like a grizzly bear in your resolute determination. I was more afraid of you than venturing into a dark woodgrove in the dead of night." Before long we were stealthily walking, with a cautious attention, a foxy furtiveness, down the earthen trails, where rocks jutted precariously out of the ground. Gnarled roots stretched out their knobbly, bony limbs, with a haughty presumptuousness. The woods were heavily furnished with verdant, lacy ferns, shade-loving plants of all kinds, all caught up in the shadowy abyss. It was dark in the forest, but cracks through the trees allowed prisms of silvery light to dance on the forest floor. But the trees that surrounded us on every side were densely dark, thick, very bushy. It felt oppressive, a little like being on a field, and the cows are closing in on you from every side. Only this was 1,000 times worse. The outlines of the trees scribbled on the background in an inky charcoal were menacing. They charged the atmosphere with an ill-mannered, hostile sense of foreboding. It didn't help that the leaves rustled, boughs swaggered, and trees whooshed, groaned, and rattled, as the wind seemed to punnel not only them, but our clothes as well. And occasionally an unseen branch would seemingly grab us, scratching us rudely, so that you felt as if a bony, skeletal, ghostly hand was dragging you down into the treacherously deep, insidious hollows of the earth. Our feet clobbered the ground, pressing the recently fallen leaf litter under our feet, and then very suddenly my world began to spin around and around and around. I found myself in the very spot where I'd experienced my nightmare as a 7-year-old girl. Everything was the same. The fauna, the flora, the ambience. Every tree that I could not see. Every sound that I could not hear. The feeling of the air whipping against my face, and the woodland smells of moss intermingled with wild jasmine on my nose. Suddenly everything in the forest changed. Absolutely everything. The forest became stiffly mute, as if it was holding its breath. The only sound I could hear was the rambunctious beats of my heart, booming, and faster and faster and faster it went. Every hair on the back of my neck was standing up on edge. I began to break out in a hot sweat, as if I'd suddenly developed a very high fever. I felt as if the ground was going to swallow me whole, like a whale. I could feel my legs crumbling beneath me, my feet almost wobbling unsteadily, as if they were struggling to gain purchase. And then I saw what I'd seen in my dreams as a 7-year-old girl. The blazing yellow eyes staring at me through the curtain of foliage, the tall lofty silhouette, the huge black blob behind the trees. Suddenly my curiosity dwindled, hijacked by an overwhelming terror. I found myself like that 7-year-old girl, caught up in an insidious nightmare. My breath had been sucked right out of me. I screamed. My crumbling legs appeared to gain new strength, as a powerful adrenaline jolt boosted my energy. I began to hightail it as fast as I could back to the house, my ankles twisting, my legs heavy and cumbersome, my feet tripping over roots and lifting up wet leaves. As I got closer and closer to the farmhouse that was draped in a soft moonlight, something reached out to grab me. I screamed, closing my eyes. I began fighting and kicking for dear life. I was certain the monster from my nightmares had grabbed me. Then I heard a voice. "Calm down. It's only me. I'm not going to hurt you." To my surprise, I looked up to see the face of Jack Beveridge staring down at me. I don't know who was more surprised, him or me. Moments later, Nancy arrived on the scene. She had run out of the woodgrove and was breathing heavily, and she looked terribly annoyed. "What did you leave me in the woods for?" she asked me. "Is this some kind of a practical joke? Because if it is, I'm not laughing. You know I'm scared of the dark. How could you just run off like that? It freaked me out." "You didn't see it?" I asked her, trembling. "See what? What are you talking about?" "The yellow eyes, looking at us through the foliage, the big blob of black behind the tree, watching us. Surely you saw it." "I didn't see anything of the kind, but I did hear you screaming like a banshee and hightailing it out of the woods as fast as you could. You practically gave me a heart attack, Amelia." "I don't know what you two girls are on about," said Mr. Beveridge. "I thought I heard a noise outside the house, so I went to investigate. It seems I must have heard the two of you ferreting around. The last thing I expected to see was two young women gallivanting around the woods in the middle of the night. It's not safe, you know. There are things out there. Now come along inside, and I will get the wife to prepare you a hot toddy. For the record," he said to me, "a lot of animals give off a yellow eye shine in the dark, you know. But if you're not used to this part of the world, you might not be aware of that. And going out there in the woods at night is a hell of a frightening, especially if you're not used to it." Jack Beveridge, like his wife, was a lovely man. I felt embarrassed that I'd caused such a commotion, and raised him out of his bed, on my fortuitous pursuit for an ambiguous creature I thought may well have been a Bigfoot. What the hell was I thinking? Mrs. Beveridge had woken up, and was wearing a nightgown over her pyjamas. She looked terribly concerned about us, and insisted her husband return to bed. Soon Mrs. Beveridge had made us hot cups of cocoa with marshmallows on the top, and she sat at the kitchen table, looking at us through earnest eyes. "What is all this about?" she asked us curiously. "You, my dear," she said, looking at me with a worried glint in her eyes, "look like you've just seen a ghost. Are you sure you're all right? In my experience, young women don't go running into the woods for no reason at all, at such an ungodly hour of the night.
What you did was most absurd, if you don't mind my saying so." "Thank you, Mrs. Beveridge," said Nancy, nodding in agreement. "I tried to tell Amelia here that going into the woods in the middle of the night was a bad idea, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. She was most insistent that we went." Mrs. Beveridge's eyes focused intently on me, with an inquiring look. "Well, you know," I said, shrugging my shoulders, "I thought I saw something big going through the trees, that's all." "She thought, Mrs. Beveridge, what my friend is failing to tell you is she thought she saw a Bigfoot. This is coming from my best friend, who, dare I tell you, was scoffing at Philip yesterday during our art class when he was talking about the Fae. Moments later, in the middle of the night, she's waking me up, telling me she thinks she might have seen a Bigfoot." "I've seen a Bigfoot," said Mrs. Beveridge, in such a matter-of-fact way, as if she was talking about feeding the chickens. "You have?" I asked her, my eyes growing wide with astonishment. "Oh, I have," said Mrs. Beveridge. "Of course my husband will not believe a word of it. But I saw the Bigfoot close up, and so how could my mind have been playing tricks on me? But try telling that to my husband, will you?" "Your husband sounds just like Amelia here," said Nancy with disdain. "Amelia will never believe anything until she actually physically sees it. She's always been like that, and it drives me insane. The only reason she's considering that Bigfoot might actually be real is because she thought she saw one tonight, disappearing into the trees. That's why she insisted on following it into the grove, and got freaked out when we were in the woods, as a nightmare she had as a kid came springing back to life, like a bad omen for her." "How extraordinary," said Mrs. Beveridge, running a hand reflectively through her long brown hair, that was lying in a long curtain around her shoulders. "What's extraordinary?" asked Nancy. "Well, the same thing happened to me, after I saw the Bigfoot. I went chasing after it into the woods, I was so intrigued. You'd think I'd be apprehensive and very fearful, but nothing of the kind. On the contrary, I was fascinated, totally and utterly intrigued by the creature. It had such an outer-worldly energy about it that drew me like iron filings to a magnet. I couldn't help myself. I just had to run after it. I didn't think of the ramifications, of course. I just ran." "See, Nancy," I told her, "I'm not so crazy after all, running after that Bigfoot. It seems it's a natural response." "What happened?" I asked Mrs. Beveridge. "Won't you tell us your story? I'm so intrigued." "Well, it was summer, and oh my gosh, it was a sweltering hot day. I had the kitchen door which leads on to the deck wide open, so the air could come into the kitchen, and there was, thankfully, a cool breeze blowing. Try cooking on a hot day, when the temperature is soaring hot. The oven makes it 1,000 times worse. I'd been making a plethora of apple pies, and the cinnamon and apples permeated the entire kitchen. Tell me about it, Mrs. Beveridge. The smells in your kitchen drive me insane. All of us in the art class just can't stop commenting on the delicious food smells that you create. Even when we're outside painting, we can smell them." I patted my stomach appreciatively. "One thing about this place is I shall never get anorexia here." Mrs. Beveridge chuckled. "Funny you say that. A young woman was sent here once precisely for that reason. She had anorexia, and within a day she was actually eating. She returned home 12 pounds heavier, and is now a reformed anorexic, passionate about food. I gather she opened her own restaurant. But anyway, getting back to my story, I was minding my own business in the kitchen, bustling away as I always do. I'd given some apple peelings to Bertie, who, believe it or not, was a significantly slimmer pot-belly pig in those days. Not so much any more, I hasten to say. I can tell you I love being in the kitchen, but on this day the heat was an absolute killer. I mean, sweat was pouring down my face, trickling down the back of my legs. That's how bad it was. But I'd promised to bake over 100 apple pies for an order I'd received for a wedding party that some young lady was having. The woman in question is a very good family friend who tasted my apple pie and begged me to make it for her wedding. I didn't feel I was in a position to say no to her, but I was seriously beginning to regret doing so, for making 100 apple pies in hot weather is insufferable. Anyway, I'd placed apple pies on the table on the patio to cool down, and was constantly going outdoors to count them. At that time I had 75 completed, but there was still more to go. I shook my head. Mrs. Beveridge, that's incredible! 100 apple pies! In a dreadful heat wave! You really are a domestic goddess. Well, I don't know about that, but it's very nice of you to say so, Amelia. Anyway, I was going out onto the patio to put out a couple more steaming apple pies on the table, which would now make the number 77. I was holding one of the steaming pies with oven gloves, about to put it on the table, and that was when I saw this tall, lofty Bigfoot standing over my table, examining the apple pies. And I knew she wanted one. She was drooling. She'd picked one apple pie up in her hands and was smelling it, and when she saw me staring at her, she hurriedly put down the apple pie and ran as fast as she could into the woodgrove. I think she was upset that she'd been seen by me. I ran after her with a cool apple pie in my hand, calling after her, "Please don't go! Wait! I want to give you an apple pie!" I ran into the woods looking for her. I knew she was there. I could feel her eyes on me, but I could see nothing. I was so disappointed. I just said, "I'm putting this apple pie on this tree branch over here. Please bring the glass container back for me." Of course, I didn't believe she would. But the very next day, as true as eggs is eggs, not only did I receive my glass bowl back, but there was a large fish in the glass container, which I cooked for lunch that day, and it was absolutely delicious. "You know what I think, Mrs. Beveridge," I said. "I think your apple pie smells wafted all over the countryside. And the Bigfoot, well, she just couldn't resist, could she? These days I often go to the woodgrove, especially when I make apple pies, and I leave one for her. She always returns my glass container, usually with some kind of gift inside it. More often it's a fish, although I've received stones, bird nests, ginseng, stuff like that from her. But I've never seen her again, I hasten to say. But I know she's out there. I tell my husband this, but he doesn't believe a word of it." "But what about the fish you received in the glass container? How does your husband explain that conundrum?" "Well, he thinks someone from town dropped it off anonymously for me, because I do charitable things for people, you see." "That's ridiculous," I said. "Well, it is what it is. Mrs. Beveridge, do you think the yellow eyes and the black blob that Amelia saw staring at her through the trees tonight could have been the very same Bigfoot you encountered that day, the one you caught sniffing your apple pie?" "Very possibly, and more than likely," said Mrs. Beveridge. "I wouldn't be at all surprised. It's interesting, Amelia, if you've had this nightmare as a child. It suggests to me that it's not by random chance you're at this art retreat. I suspect it wasn't a monster you saw in your dream after all, but a benign, benevolent Bigfoot that means you no harm. Maybe telepathically the Bigfoot was reaching out to you through your dreams, but you misinterpreted the yellow eyes as something menacing. Either that, or you had some kind of prognostication. Who knows? But I will say this to you. I will never forget that Bigfoot's dark eyes as she looked at me that day. Oh, they were beautiful, so very kind. My old grandmother used to say that eyes are the window of the soul, and you can see a person's heart through their eyes. I think she's right, you know. I don't know if you've ever watched a serial killer on television before, but if you look at their eyes, they're as cold as ice, dead, devoid of any emotion." "Mrs. Beveridge, how did you know that the Bigfoot was actually female?" I asked her. "Well, it's obvious, isn't it? She had breasts, small breasts, but also a very gentle feminine energy. I could feel it. I felt a distinct connection with her, and I so wanted to give her an apple pie, because of all the people who have drooled over my apple pies over the years, no one has looked at them with the longing I saw on her face." "Do you think, Mrs. Beveridge, that the Bigfoot would have pinched one of your apple pies if you hadn't been looking?" "Well, I sincerely hope she would have done so," said Mrs. Beveridge. "I mean, if she lives here on this estate in our woodgrove, I'd like her to think she was an extension of our family, like Bertie, the hens and the horses." "Wow, that's an incredible story." "I tell you what," said Mrs. Beveridge, "now I cannot make any promises to you. I wish I could, but I'm not psychic, so I'm not sure if this would even remotely work. But I will give you an apple pie to take into the woodgrove tomorrow. Who knows, maybe the Bigfoot will show herself to you. I sincerely hope she does. I can't help thinking if you kept having that extraordinary nightmare as a young child, that maybe you shall encounter her. Although if my husband was to hear me now, he would say I was borderline insane. We finished our cocos and went to bed, but Nancy was like a dog with a bone. She wouldn't let it go that I had abandoned her in the woodgrove in the dead of night. How could you, Amelia? Some friend you are. I told you I was scared of the dark, and you just bogged off without a by your leave. I could feel my blood boiling. Nancy, I didn't bloody leave you, and I wasn't being deliberately mean. I left you. I was freaking out. I was so scared. Can you not appreciate that? When you think you're being pursued by something, you run away, don't you? You don't stop and think, hold on a moment, is my friend all right? Your survival instincts kick in just like they do for a deer when they're being pursued by a mountain lion. I still think you were inconsiderate, Amelia. The following morning, me and Nancy awoke from our beds with vigorous appetites, as we could smell bacon permeating the air. Nancy groaned. "Oh, my God, that smells good," she said, looking at me beseechingly. "I'm sorry, but I'm famished, Amelia. And guess what? If I waddle out of this place like a duck, I don't actually care. We're never ever going to get food like this again, so I fully intend to enjoy it. The diet and all the lettuce leaves can wait for Los Angeles." There was only one problem. Nancy found that morning that she couldn't get the zipper up of her jeans at all, even as she tugged and stretched the fabric as hard as she possibly could. It would seem the zipper had come apart in her hands and was dangling in her fingers like a silvery ribbon. I burst out laughing. I couldn't help myself. It was so funny. But to be fair, my laughter sounded more like a witch's cackle. It was hilarious to see the roll of blubber over my friend's stomach that had not existed a week before. It was kind of satisfying to know that my skinny friend would appreciate how annoying it is to carry a few extra pounds that was seemingly impossible to shift. In the past, she had ridiculed me for making such complaints. Nancy's face went white. She wasn't amused. "That's it, Amelia. I'm going to have to wear one of your jeans. I cannot fit into any of my stuff anymore. I can't believe this has happened to me," she bleated. "Well, you shouldn't wear such snug-fitting clothes, should you?" I griped. "I mean, don't you own any baggy stuff like a normal person does?" The laughter on my lips faded when Amelia slipped into my jeans with effortless ease. And worse still, they were baggy on her, which made me suddenly feel conspicuously large. I had to remind myself that Nancy had always been naturally thin, while I, on the other hand, had always been slightly overweight, or plump if you like. Still, it wasn't a pleasant sight to see her swimming in my clothes. When we went down to breakfast with the art students, Mrs. Beveridge showed me the apple pie she'd baked for the Bigfoot. She had a big warm smile on her face. Blanche Beveridge was certainly one of the nicest people you could ever hope to meet. "As I told you," she said to us, "I'm not sure you will see our Bigfoot friend. She's desperately reticent, but who knows? It's worth a try, is it not?" Much as me and Nancy were thoroughly enjoying the art retreat and the instruction that we received from Philip, it was great to have the day off to do our own thing. In the morning we went to the town to buy souvenirs and all kinds of little trinkets for friends and family. We bought T-shirts, stickers, mugs, teddy bears, packets of fudge, posters, and bags with a sign on them that read, "Want a break? Look no further than the mountains." In the afternoon we happily returned back to home base, with our hearts fully set on taking a stroll in the woods, in the hope we might encounter the Bigfoot. I began to believe the terrifying yellow eyes I'd seen the previous night, staring at me through the trees, may well have belonged to the Bigfoot, the very creature I observed from the bedroom window, and stealthily followed into the woods at the most obscene hour of the night, dragging a very reluctant Nancy with me, who was still struggling to forgive me for abandoning her in the woods. I suppose I couldn't really blame her. If the boot were indeed on the other foot, I would have been as mad as hell with her. When Mrs. Beveridge told us her incredulous story, she was such a credible woman, I believed her at once. I was certain the Bigfoot was real. If that was the case, why had I doubted Philip and his story about the Fae? Maybe my mind was beginning to shift, and the cynicism in me fade like the dye in a pair of blue jeans. On this pleasing autumn afternoon, serenaded by a rich kaleidoscope of golds, ambers, russets and reds, where sculptural branches were swathed in resplendent finery, and a soft light slipped delicately through the trees, powdering the landscape in a subtle illumination that peppered the forest floor like a disco ball of moving light. We trudged through the trees wearing our walking boots, jeans and sweaters. We could see insects dancing in the prisms of light, buzzing and circulating around the woodland flowers, and hear the fluttering of feathers above our heads as the birds flew in the branches, trilling their pretty bird song high up in the trees. It felt rather ridiculous to be walking into the depths of the wood, with an apple pie in my hand, and the ground so bumpy, rippled with jagged rocks. I very nearly fell over, and the apple pie could have gone flying across the forest floor. Luckily Nancy stopped me in time and steadied me so that I didn't go collapsing into a heap. "Honestly, Amelia," she sighed in exasperation, "watch where you're going, or we won't have anything to leave the Bigfoot." Finally we found a tree stump that had been cut down and looked like a rounded miniature table in the middle of the woods, and that was where we decided to put the apple pie. "What do we do now?" I asked Nancy, once we'd placed the apple pie on the stump. "We should whistle," said Nancy. "I think that might get the Bigfoot's attention. Maybe we should even knock on a tree. I heard Bigfoots respond to tree knocks." "Well, how do you know that?" I asked her. Nancy shrugged. "I don't know, I just think I remember hearing it somewhere." "Fine," I said. "Let's give it a try. But I'm warning you, I can't whistle." Nancy found a stone and began to bang a tree trunk with the stone 7 times, and then she let out a whistle. "You're good," I said, amazed. "That really is incredible." We sat there very impatiently, I might add, on the forest floor, our knees crossed, waiting and hoping that the female Bigfoot would make an appearance, or at the very least respond to our whistles and wood knocks. I mean, seriously, who were we kidding? All we could hear was the birds' twitter, but beyond the swaying trees and the cool breeze, we heard nothing. "Well," I said, rising to my feet, "we've done what we could, haven't we? We'll leave the apple pie for the Bigfoot on the tree stump over there. She'll know it's from Mrs. Beveridge, I'm sure. But she's obviously not coming, so let's make tracks back to the farmhouse." I could feel the disappointment welling up in my chest, but I knew Bigfoots were naturally evasive and reticent. What made me think for a single moment that I was so special that one would make its appearance known to me? Then all of a sudden we heard 7 tree knocks and a very distinctive whistle. We also heard thunderous feet moving through the woods, like something of a sizable weight that was walking towards us. "Shh! Shh! Listen, Nancy," I said, raising my fingers to my lips excitedly. "Did you hear that?" She nodded. I did. Then all of a sudden everything went still. As the woodgrove held its breath, the forest became mute. I knew the Bigfoot was there. I could feel her powerful energy, sense her eyes watching us. But it was so infuriating because I failed to see her. But I knew she was hiding in plain sight, so my eyes refused to give up on her. I was resolutely determined to find her. I knew she had to be there. I was about to give up when this gargantuan blob of cinnamon brown moved behind a tree trunk so quickly. But I knew what I'd seen, so my eyes pinned in on that spot with a tunnel vision. And then I saw her, as did Nancy. She stood there, majestic, imposing, lofty, easily over 8 foot tall, 600 to 700 pounds, with long flowing hair, small breasts, and overlong arms. She possessed the most benevolent, but the kindest brown eyes I have ever beheld. And in their depths I saw an outer worldly intelligence, as if she could read my intentions, my thoughts, as if she knew all about me, more than I could have ever imagined. The next thing I knew, the Bigfoot spoke to me. Her attention was directed towards me and not to Nancy, and the words she spoke were foreign, but I knew exactly what they meant, as absurd as that may sound. "Gilaquina holikolobansi." So here you are, after all this time. I didn't think you would see me. as you have so much doubt in your heart, don't you? But yes, I'm real, and thank you for the apple pie you brought. Gilati kakwina, hasikali no kolopo, si fasha. If I was in any doubt that she had said it. Nancy affirmed to me those were her direct words. The Bigfoot retrieved the apple pie from the tree stump, her eyes brightening as she lifted the glass container to her nose to smell its delicious aromas. She said to us, Gilatwina ogolasina. I'm sorry, I don't share. This pie is too good. Don't worry, I said, it's yours. I could swear she gave me an amused wink. She nodded her head towards us, then disappeared from our sight, moving with such a seamless grace as she swung her arms backwards and forwards. I believe she was testing me to see if I had bypassed my doubting skepticism. It was only because I had faith in seeing her that my faith was subsequently rewarded. Even if it was so brief, I was ever grateful, knowing how exceedingly privileged I was to have such an outlandish encounter with such an extraordinary creature who was undoubtedly human in every regard. I think my art teacher Philip was right. The universe had taught me an invaluable lesson. Don't be so presumptuous about what you believe. Ostensibly since then I've paid close attention to that sagacious advice, and have been reluctant to not approach things with a more open mind. When we told Mrs. Beveridge that we'd encountered the female Bigfoot, she was terribly pleased. Oh, I'm so glad you saw her. I had a funny feeling you would. Some things are just meant to be, aren't they? The next day during our tea break on the art course, I took my teacher to one side. I owe you an apology, Philip, I told him. Let's just say the universe has shown me indirectly that there are rarely more things on heaven and earth than you ever imagined possible. I'm glad to tell you I'm beginning to believe your grandfather's story about the Fae, and that it may well be true.
Oh, but it's true, Amelia, said Philip. Why would I make something up as efficacious and momentous as this, if it were not? Suffice to say he didn't seem surprised by my candid confession. I thought you would be chagrined in one way or another. The Fae have their prodigious tools to work on the diminished to our mute of mind. Whatever happened to change your acumen can only be a good thing. There is nothing worse in this life than a hardened cynic. People who have no faith and struggle to believe in the afterlife, for example, are the very ones who have the most difficult time passing to the next world. They don't believe in anything beyond this life. So during the dying process they are filled with great fear and trepidation. Ask any nurse that works with the dying. They'll tell you that. They're the ones who struggle the most. All these years later, I think of that art retreat as one of the most profound, sententious experiences of my life, and it changed me from a naysayer to a protagonist, and now my life is all the more richer. And now these days I believe anything is possible. As for my brother, when he asked me, "How was it in regards to your holiday break at that little art retreat in the mountains?" I told him, "It wasn't so little as it happens, and it was one of the best adventure holidays I've ever been on. As like a closed rose petal in the backyard, I've finally opened." "Really? You do surprise me," he said. "I wouldn't think painting would be that fun." "You don't know the half of it," I told him. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.